To order. Representative Pugh, would you lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance? Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for being here today. My name is David Rowe. I have the privilege of serving the 85th Legislative District, which covers Union, Snyder, Juniata, and Mifflin counties. I also have the honor of serving as the Republican Policy Committee Chair. I want to start off with all of the members getting a chance to introduce themselves and their districts. We're going to start with Representative Zimmerman on the end and work our way all the way down.
Representative Dave Zimmerman served the northeast part of Lancaster County and southern Berks.
Good morning, Representative Barb Gleim. I serve the northwest portion of Cumberland County.
Dallas Kephart, I serve Clearfield and Cambria County.
Good morning, Dane Watro. I serve Schuylkill and portions of Schuylkill and Luzerne County.
I'm Representative Schlegel, representing the 101st Legislative District in the heart of Lebanon County.
Joe Diorsi, 47th District, Eastern York County.
Good morning, Jim Struzzi, 62nd Legislative District, Indiana County.
Good morning, Mark Anderson, 92nd District, Northern York County.
Brenda Pugh, northeast section of Luzerne County in 120th.
Good morning, Tom Jones, 98th Legislative District, the northwest corner of Lancaster County and the southwest corner of Lebanon County.
Thank you. We also have Chairwoman, go ahead, Chairwoman.
Representative Kathy Rapp. I represent the Great Northwest of Warren, Forest, and parts of Crawford. Thank you.
And we're also just being joined by Representative Twardzik from Schuylkill County. It is a session morning, so we will have some people coming and going. We'll also have some folks online. I want to start things off by having Representative Dallas Kephart, who is our Deputy Chairman of Government Efficiency, to deliver some opening remarks. Representative Kephart.
Well, thank you, Chairman Rowe, and I appreciate you having this hearing and discussing this important topic of regulatory reform. Ms. Green and Mr. Kane, thank you both for being here and your testimony, and thank you to both of your organizations that have been in the trenches of advocating for free market solutions. So I have been a big fan of both of your organizations for years. So before I ever ran for office, I championed regulatory reform and measures including the REINS Act. Overburdensome regulations are a tax on American producers and consumers. Unneeded regulations often stifle economic growth and make things more expensive. That's why we need legislation like the REINS Act to rein it in, burdensome regulations, and deliver accountability. REINS being regulations from the executive and need to scrutiny. Regulatory reform and accountability is among my top priorities in Harrisburg. It is critical that elected officials be held accountable for rules and regulations, not just punt tough questions to an ever-expanding bureaucracy that is accountable to no one. The bureaucracy as a hidden fourth branch of government is unelected and unaccountable. That needs to end. I want to be clear, legislation like the REINS Act does not repeal one regulation. The REINS Act does not prevent any particular regulation from being put in place. No, what the REINS Act does is require accountability. Politicians have wiped their hands clean for far too long and claimed that they weren't responsible after burdensome regulations hurt individuals and businesses, saying, I didn't vote for it. Meanwhile, the same politicians empowered the unelected bureaucracy and bureaucrats that did so. It is time for the political games and showmanship to end. The REINS Act would require economically significant regulations for the state level. My bill and the Senate version, Senator Kiefer's, set those regulations at $1 million in value, while the federal legislation is $100 million, to be voted on by elected officials. The elected officials will take a vote up or down, and the results control the day. If it is a reasonable regulation, it will become enacted, and there are some, like price transparency rules when it becomes health care. That would be a regulation that we probably should have, but if not, there's lots of bad ones we can name. The regulation will not be enacted. At the end of the day, it would be the people's representatives that will have their say, and there will be a record of where they stand for the people they represent to see. I look forward to today's discussion on regulatory reform, and thank you again, Chairman Rowe, for having this important hearing.
Thank you, Representative Kephart. Representative Kephart summarized it very well. I think for those of you who can see, this headline also summarizes it very well. This is an ABC 7 headline that says Arkansas builds steel mill faster than Pennsylvania would permit one. And if that doesn't summarize why this hearing is important, I can't think of something else that does. Because the truth is that Pennsylvania is overregulated. We have more than 166,000 regulatory restrictions. We're the 12th most regulated state in the nation. Our regulatory code is so bloated that it would take an individual 18 and a half weeks of full-time reading just to get through it. And that's actually not a badge of honor. It's a true barrier to growth. We hear it repeatedly that manufacturers, trades, energy developers, they are fleeing to neighboring states like Ohio, like West Virginia, like Arkansas, like Florida, where it's easier to get permits, hire workers, and grow their businesses. Every delay in permitting or licensure is a missed paycheck, a missed opportunity, a missed investment in Pennsylvania's future. The truth is that this red tape is strangling small businesses and family-run operations, making it even harder for Pennsylvanians to start, expand, or even sustain their businesses here in the Commonwealth. So we're here to talk about streamlining duplicative regulations, modernizing outdated codes, and getting rid of the nonsense that does more harm than good and fails to serve the people of Pennsylvania. So I want to thank our two excellent testifiers we have here today. Ms. Emily Green, she is the Pennsylvania State Director for Americans for Prosperity, and Mr. Kevin Kane, who is the Director of Legislative Strategy for the Commonwealth Foundation. We'd like to invite both of you to give us 3 to 5 minutes of testimony, and then we're going to have questions and answers from the members. Ms. Green, you're up first.
Chairman Rowe and honorable members of the House GOP Policy Committee, on behalf of Americans for Prosperity, the Commonwealth's largest grassroots organization, and our tens of thousands of activists across all 67 counties, I want to thank you for the opportunity to advocate on behalf of the most important constituency in Harrisburg, the Pennsylvania taxpayer. June marks the start of budget season, and there's never been a more important time than now to promote common sense, pro-growth policy ideas. As we speak, Governor Shapiro and House Democrats are advocating for policies that increase spending by 7.5% over last year's budget, continuing to feed into our structural deficit. As a result, Pennsylvania taxpayers will pay, and this will continue to drive out our population as they flee for greener pastures. We must do better. This budget season, as we work to avoid June gloom and create a brighter, sunnier path to fiscal prosperity for the Commonwealth, AFP-PA's activists bring to the table several recommendations for making Pennsylvania prosper by reining in regulatory barriers. Did you know that Pennsylvania is the 14th most regulated state in the nation? According to the Mercatus Center, Pennsylvania currently competes with states like New York, New Jersey, and California for a race to the bottom, or a race to see who can regulate their state out of business. If we strive to be competitive as hell with our neighboring states such as Ohio and West Virginia, we can do so by reining in the administrative state and restoring legislative oversight over regulations with a price tag of over $1 million. The REINS Act, or regulations from the executive in need of scrutiny, is sweeping the nation. 5 states across the country have enacted the REINS Act this year, and 3 states such as Ohio and North Carolina have made strides to get this done in short order. Pennsylvania can be set up for success by ensuring that taxpayers have greater oversight over regulations that impact their livelihoods. Regulations imposed on Pennsylvanians stretch beyond just economic red tape. In fact, one of the greatest burdens to high-quality, low-cost healthcare takes the form of occupational licensing barriers. In Pennsylvania, we face a critical healthcare shortage, yet qualified advanced practice registered nurses face onerous and costly hurdles to practice to the fullest extent of their education. Legislation introduced in both chambers, both with bipartisan support, would alleviate the burden to practice in regions of the Commonwealth where healthcare practitioners are sorely needed. By removing the burden of physician collaborative agreements after 3,600 hours or 3 years, APRNs may then practice to the fullest extent of their expertise and help ensure that wait times are low and quality of care is high. Finally, through comprehensive land use reform, Harrisburg can work to deliver common sense policies that drive up housing availability and subsequently lower the cost of housing for renters and home buyers. According to the National Association of Home Buyers, in 2024, almost half of Americans couldn't afford to purchase a $250,000 home. through sound reforms such as eliminating single-family zoning laws and allowing for duplexes, triplexes, and quadplexes. Increased supply will avoid prohibitive pricing for buyers and renters. Additionally, Harrisburg can take action to prevent commercial-only zoning, which would allow for mixed-use buildings that will create availability, as well as address the issue of post-COVID offices that sit vacant across Pennsylvania. We can and we must get to work to create a more prosperous Pennsylvania. As spending proposals and new regulations rear their ugly heads this June, our taxpayer activists urge you to rein in the red tape that makes housing less affordable, healthcare less accessible, and prevents Pennsylvanians from living out their version of their American dream. I thank you for your time today and welcome any questions.
Thank you, Director Green. Mr. Kane.
Good morning. Thank you, Chairman Rowe and members of the committee. It's good to see so many friendly faces to kick off a session week in June. It's no secret that we have significant financial problems facing our state. Pennsylvania routinely is ranked poor in economic outlook and performance. In fact, this year, ALEC, so the American Legislative Exchange Council, ranks us 44th. To Emily's point, we're in a race to the bottom. These guys are taking into account things like outmigration, our regulatory environment, GDP, and lost jobs and opportunity. And the regulatory environment is a huge driver in that poor performance. When we talk about red tape, it's not just the regulations on the books, it's jobs, it's opportunities, and it's the future of our Commonwealth. Pennsylvania has over 164,000 regulations. It's an unfathomable number. We are 22% more regulated than the average state, and we're costing ourselves. These are not just numbers, these are not just statistics. While our organization did find that regulatory reform and comprehensive reg reform would be transformative for our state, before we even get to the state problems, Pennsylvania loses about 360 businesses and over 5,000 jobs just from federal regulation alone. So we're making it even harder to do business with overburdensome state regulation. Our study found that if we slashed a little bit over a third of that, so 36% of the regulatory burden on the state, we would produce $9.2 billion more in GDP. We would create 180,000 more jobs, and we would give each household about $1,700 more. These are numbers that matter. And it's not just about the numbers, so I'm sure all of you have examples in your districts where small businesses are fighting tooth and nail to survive, and we're only making it harder here in Harrisburg with our regulatory environment. And it's in the headlines too. The governor says he wants to make the state more competitive, but the actions don't match his words. Shapiro himself admitted that we lost Fairlife to New York. New York is no friend to do business with, and we're losing to New York. He keeps talking about Ohio. Let's start with New York. Fairlife presented the opportunity for us to have the largest milk processing plant in the Northeast, and our dairy farmers lost because of bureaucratic regulatory delays. And that's not a one-off. In Clinton County, we lost a $1 billion natural gas plant for the same bureaucratic delays. And that one was even more criminal in that DEP took 2 years, 2 full years, that's a legislative session, to address a permit that was levied against the group from an outside environmental group. It's unacceptable. We're not being a good partner or friend to do business. And I'll give the governor credit. He's very good at coming up with the flashy new program. There's a couple acronyms. You hear about payback and fast track and speed. And they're well-intentioned, and they've seen some success, but we are taking the smallest bite of the smallest apple. And it feels like Pennsylvania just can't get ahead. And they might sound good at a press conference when we lure in, a $20 billion Amazon deal, and no one wants to knock that. That's a great investment in our state. But what does it actually mean for the average business trying to get by in your district? I would challenge the governor to think a little bit more about a comprehensive approach and deliver on some of those campaign promises that he talked about in 2022. Regulatory reform and the kind of regulatory reform that would transform our state is possible. Just last week, we saw the Pennsylvania Senate offer 2 great proposals, REINS Act, which we heard a lot about so far today, and then Senate Bill 444, which would institute a 3-year review to make sure the regs that are on the books actually are beneficial to our economy. And these are, again, bills that the House majority could act on today. You guys have a lot of great proposals in your own chamber, and I commend you for that work. But let's take a look at other states, right? These don't just have to be ideas. These could be real life solutions that are working elsewhere. We hear a lot about Ohio, and for a guy who's so tired of losing to Ohio, we're getting our ass kicked. A couple years ago, Ohio implemented a regulatory reduction program, and it was really common sense. We're gonna cut some of the existing regulation, and we're gonna limit new regulations from going into place. So they did that a couple years back, and they're well on their way to their stated goal of meeting 30% reduction by 2025. But in 2022, the numbers speak for themselves. Since then, Ohio's economy has grown 13%. Median income is up $3,000. They've created 170,000 jobs. This isn't just an idea or a proposal in a bill. We're seeing these things work. And if you don't want to look at Ohio, look at Virginia. Virginia's a great case study because you had a Democrat governor start the program. Ralph Northam took two state agencies, and he said, look, take stock of what regulations are on the books, cut them 25%. Republican governor Glenn Youngkin came in just 2 years later. Youngkin expanded it to almost all state agencies. Pretty common sense. It was working with two, why not try it with all? So in Virginia now, they're down almost 20% in regulations, and each year they save their taxpayers and businesses $1.2 billion. So again, we don't have to look very far to see these programs work, but there's great proposals on the table here in Pennsylvania. And if you still have doubt, I think, with that much red tape, you gotta ask yourself honestly, are there any red flags? And I think there are. We have 164,000. Chairman Rowe pointed out that it would take 740 hours, 18 and a half weeks. To put it in terms our governor would understand, that's over 62,000 TikToks. So we know there's a lot on the books. And some of them are ridiculous and punitive. I think, one of the only things harder for paper companies to print off all of these regulations is the 4,200 regulations they have to jump through to do business in the Commonwealth. And my favorite example is Philadelphia. I'm from Philly. And if you drive in the city of Philadelphia, you're probably asking yourself, wow, it looks like you can park wherever you want. You'd be wrong. The Philadelphia Parking Authority has 1,200 regulations that dictate when, where, and how you can park your car. We have to ask ourselves if we can do better. I think, fortunately, the members of this committee realize that. Thankfully, the Pennsylvania Senate realizes that. And I am encouraged. And I would just ask that as we get into budget season, upping our corporate welfare to $1.6 billion is not a real solution. Coming up with the ABC new acronym program that might sound good at the governor's press conference is not a real solution. Our businesses are asking for the kind of transformative, comprehensive reform that would actually offer regulatory relief for all businesses. And I appreciate that many of you on this committee are thinking that way. So I'm encouraged and thankful for all of your hard work and look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Kane. Thank you both of you. Such an excellent summary of the challenges that Pennsylvanians are facing. I remember last legislative session, the policy committee held a hearing in the central part of the state, and we talked to a business owner, just a two-man shop, he and his wife, and his full-time job was running the business. His wife's full-time job was compliance. All she did full-time, 40-plus hours a week, was just compliance. So imagine if we were able to take their workload, cut it, like some states have done, by 25%, 30%, and actually give her the ability to then, hey, now she can put more time into the business, more money into the business, because these dollars, when we're talking about the billions of dollars of costs that it takes, those are costs that are being passed along to the consumer. These are not costs that are being borne by the state, which is still a taxpayer-funded entity, but these are direct-to-consumer costs that these regulations are responsible for. We have a bunch of members who have got questions, so gear up, you two. It's going to be fun. We're going to start off with Representative Zimmerman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks, Emily and Kevin, for your testimony. So what we end up getting involved in, so as legislators, we end up putting laws in place, and then we're dealing with the state agencies that really put regulations in place like hand over fist, and it's way too easy. So was wondering if there's a thought on how we could make that more difficult beyond maybe even just the REINS Act, which would be very helpful. And then we get involved in municipalities as well, who continue to add ordinances, and they're very different from one township to another, from one borough to another. And Kevin, you mentioned Fairlife, and I just want to throw one other one in. So the Phillips family in Chester County, which I've learned to know very well. So it's several years ago, but still the same kind of issue. So they have a 50-acre tract. It's a large mushroom operation that they wanted to build the latest, greatest mushroom house. And so they worked for 2 years with the township, with the county, and and DEP was a big stumbling block and got nowhere. And so they were driving in Maryland one day, and there's a farm for sale. They bought the farm, and that's county government. They went to the county, and within 3 months, they had a plan, and the latest, greatest mushroom house in the United States is now in Maryland and could have been and would have been in Pennsylvania. Thoughts?
You know, unfortunately, we're hearing that story time and time again. So I have the privilege of serving as state director with the Pennsylvania chapter. We are one of 37 chapters across the country. We have a footprint in all 50 states. And when we get together as a group, oftentimes my colleagues will say, well, hey, thank you so much for sending your population to us. It's a real problem. The REINS Act is going to help address a lot of these issues and alleviate some of those pain points, but it is not the be-all, end-all solution. We need to come together and come up with ideas that are going to keep businesses thriving in Pennsylvania. So the REINS Act is a great first step. We are, very, cognizant of the fact that there's political challenges this legislative session, but if we can continue to beat the drum for legislative oversight over these new regulations, we're going to be in a better position to advocate for our taxpayer activists and your constituents. A lot of folks aren't leaving Pennsylvania because the governor's entering us into a conglomerate of states to address CO2 emissions. They're leaving Pennsylvania because they cannot live out their version of the American dream. So I want to thank you for championing issues alongside us.
Yeah, and I would just add, REINS is a great start. I'm grateful that Representative Kephart has the House version, and grateful the Senate passed Senator Kiefer's version. But there's a lot of good ideas out there. I'd point you to Senate Bill 462. That's Senator Phillips Hill. Senator Phillips Hill introduced the Transparency Reform and Accountability for Pennsylvania Act. This is really straightforward. It just puts together a process for reviewing and making recommendations to the General Assembly, the governor, and executive agencies. And the best part about that is after 5 years, it is gone. So we're creating a program that's planned to end after it goes in and it reviews everything we have on the books. I think a huge part of the regulatory problem is, yes, we need mechanisms to repeal and approve regulation, but a lot of it is we got to take a look what's actually on the books, because that's the first step.
Good. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Kephart.
Thank you, Chairman Rowe, and that was a great article. Actually a bad article in a way, but that you pointed to at the steel plant. It's sort of sad and it tells a story. But Kevin, you said about Renova, and I don't know if I've lectured enough times on the stupidity of that situation. Over $1 billion investment going in there and gone because these outside groups, particularly the Clean Air Council, who's funded with old oil money, but nonetheless. The irony of that situation is, wow, we had that hearing there that day, Emily, and people wanted it up there, and that's the crazy part. So these outside groups came into a place that they probably never been to, and told them that was, they weren't good enough to have it. So, also, Kevin, you mentioned corporate welfare. That's what this place's MO is. What they do is they tax and regulate everybody to death, and then they give a tax credit to their preferred political buddies and stick it to the rest of the people. So anyhow, we need permitting reform in this state. I mentioned the REINS Act, and I like to tell people that I championed that issue before I ever got elected. So, but we also need permitting reform. I can name numerous businesses in my district that have been looking for a permit and so forth, and they go to DEP, for instance, and they say, oh, you got to do this. Oh, you got to do this. Oh, you got to do this. I mean, it's just an ever-changing thing. And meanwhile, thousands of dollars have been spent and got nowhere. But, so we need permitting reform. What is a state that gets permitting reform right? Or what would be the optimal permitting reform bill look like?
That's a big question, but I think we can look at a number of states that are welcoming and accepting our population. North Carolina is a perfect example of that. I think they do permitting reform really well. Interestingly enough, they are not a rain state. Now that is looking to change. So they have passed a REINS Act bill through both chambers. They're going to take this to the governor's desk. The governor is not as familiar or friendly to this issue, right? But they are still working through divided government to get this done. And I think that's a perfect example of you can, get good permitting reform done. And the REINS Act is just that added layer of protection. It's just legislative oversight to restore the proper role of government.
Look, Dallas, what I would just add is we've seen half-hearted attempts at permitting reform in Pennsylvania, particularly with this administration, and the SPEED program. So I'd point out the SPEED program was sold as a big solution, particularly with complex DEP permits. And the governor's administration has confirmed, even though it was part of last year's budget deal, it's not even implemented yet. So it might sound like a good thing and seem like the right approach, but again, we're not thinking big enough here in Pennsylvania. It's not about a small program that picks winners and losers and we make it easier for some and don't care about the others. It has to be comprehensive.
And if I can just add to that too, it is much easier for our taxpayer activists, your constituents, to call you up and say they're having an issue with the permitting process than it is for them to submit public comment to IRC. So that's by design, right? And that's why there should be greater legislative oversight over these issues.
Yeah, well, I think it's safe to say that instead of hiring double the communication staff so he can post TikTok videos all day, maybe he should start hiring policy staff to get this stuff done.
Representative Wacho.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Second week in a row. What an amazing hearings you're having here today. Kevin and Emily, great testimony. Thank you very much. I have to say, I heard DEP over and over again today, and my personal struggle back home is with a local venue, a wedding venue, huge, and been around for decades. Wanted to expand to a second venue and ran into roadblock after roadblock after roadblock. And it's not, DEP wasn't one to give guidance. They're just one to throw their hands up and say, I don't know what to tell you. So past couple weeks, been waking up every morning, turning on the local news, and I see a picture of the signing of the Constitution. And it said over and over again, PA gets it done. Go on to the next thing, and it talks about a bridge that was fixed in record time. Coded messaging over and over and over again. And it talks about how we're getting things done, how PA gets it done right from the beginning of the signing of the Constitution, Declaration of Independence, so on and so forth. Unfortunately, PA ain't getting nothing done. Kevin, you spoke about the dairy farmers who could have landed here in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and they went elsewhere. What state did they wind up going to?
Yeah, so the Fairlife site you're talking about ended up in New York.
In New York. And you spoke about the 360 businesses. Is that every decade we're losing, or?
Yeah, so we estimate that each year, due to federal regulation alone, so before we even account for what's happening at the state level, we're on average losing 300 businesses and about 5,100 jobs each year.
Annually. Wonderful. We're not getting nothing done. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well said, Representative Wacho. Representative Ledbetter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Kane, Director Green, thank you so much for joining us this morning and for your wonderful testimony. Always beneficial to be able to gain your insight. Director Kane, you mentioned in your testimony divided government in other states. And frankly, when I've met with constituents across the Commonwealth as well as in my district, I've consistently seen a theme where business and economic growth get crushed, not by legislation passed out of the House or the Senate through open debate, but by these regulations handed down by the agencies that most of the folks that are burdened by them can't even name. Regulation without representation truly is tyranny in disguise, and public decisions deserve public debate, not bureaucratic decree. So with that in mind, my question is that given the many states that operate under divided government, where that regulatory overreach can undermine both the economic growth and the legislative accountability, how would the REINS Act help restore some of that balance between the executive and legislative branches?
Sure. So another example of where REINS Act has been successful amidst divided government is Kansas, one of the first states to approach this with a divided government. Their governor, not of the same partisan affiliation as both chambers, they were able to pass that through both chambers and override the governor. So understanding the political circumstances we're in here in Pennsylvania, we have policy majorities to build, certainly, but I think that can really serve as something to work towards. We can get this done, whether it be 2 years, 4 years, we can make Pennsylvania a REINS state.
Thank you, Director Green. Again, Chairman, these public decisions, they really do deserve public debate. I mentioned it before, but not bureaucratic decree. Thank you.
Representative Diorsi.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Emily and Kevin, for your testimony. 2 quick questions. Number one, we're talking about losing businesses and people to states like North Carolina, Tennessee, Florida, Texas. And we've touched on some of the worst actors regulatory-wise, DEP, permitting. And the REINS Act is a terrific initiative. I'm a co-sponsor. It's a great initiative. But as far as regulations that are already on the books, what are some other focus areas for us legislators with an eye for repealing?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and that's why I wanted to highlight what's going on in Ohio and in Virginia. So Ohio, in their Senate Bill 9, was a regulatory reduction program that looked at reducing regulations across the board. So they have most of their state agencies engaged in significant reg reduction, about 30% by 2025. Virginia took, I would say, a little bit more of a small step, bigger than what we've done here, but an important step in that Democrat Governor Ralph Northam required a 25% reduction across 2 state agencies, and then Republican Governor Glenn Youngkin came in and expanded it to cover most state agencies. So those reduction programs, we have models where, and both work, right? We're seeing good results in Ohio and in Virginia. You know, Ohio kind of went in off the bat, was scaling things back. Virginia, a little bit more measured. They started as a pilot program and have since expanded because of the success. So I think that is the right mindset, rather than, you know, let Governor Shapiro pick winners and losers with his programs, where we're identifying either a narrow industry or maybe 1 or 2 types of permits. I think we need to think more broadly across the board, and I'd point you to those 2 states where they've had success in that.
And I'll just add too, we've talked a lot about incentivizing businesses to stay, but a big piece of this is a housing shortage. So for example, a national coalition partner that Americans for Prosperity worked with did a recent focus group talking with folks about how they view the American dream, and if buying a house, the white picket fence American dream is still within reach. One of the gentlemen said, well, my 18-year-old child just said, I can't wait to buy a house one day. And he laughed at her and said, that's just not a realistic goal in this economy, right? So I think housing is a really big piece of this. You know, we want to address and we want to preempt local barriers through changes in state law to bolster property rights and foster economic opportunity. And Montana serves as a great case study to that. During the 2019-2020 pandemic, there was a mass exodus of blue states to Montana. They didn't know how to address this population increase because there was no housing available. So they were able to pass legislation that allowed for multifamily housing, and that solved their problems in short order. So that's something we really should look at as well.
Thank you. Additional question here, if I may. So oftentimes when we talk about educational freedom, it's not, we're not viewing it in the lens of economic impact, but the figures that I've seen prove otherwise. Historically, states with robust school choice programs are gaining population, whereas you know, states that don't have programs are losing. and then projections kind of repeat that trend. Can you speak to the economic impacts of school choice programs across the country?
Yeah, that's a great question, and thank you for your support of universal school choice. I think it's, there's a trend here in Pennsylvania where we're behind the curve a little bit, and another more concerning trend where we have these issues that Governor Shapiro said he supports, and it's been 2 years, and we've actually seen him work against that issue, unfortunately. So to your question, yes, there's a huge positive economic impact. We know that when you can read and write and do math by 3rd grade, you're set up for a lifetime of success. We also know that when you're failing, and unfortunately too many of our schools are failing, chronically so. You look at this, school district of Philadelphia, it's turning out kids in 8th grade and high school that cannot read or write, and they're set up for devastating economic consequences. And it impacts all of us, right? Because these are the people that our workforce needs to hire, that we want contributing to society, and when we're not giving them that educational opportunity, we are failing them, and they result to either they end up in the criminal justice system, or they end up on government assistance. They don't benefit from the quality education that makes them a productive and free person in society that has a job, is able to buy that house, is able to give back and raise a family. So it's disappointing that we're watching so many other states ease their regulatory burden on businesses, and then when people do go there for jobs, they have options, right? They're not trapped in a district school that maybe doesn't best fit their needs. I don't think it's a mistake that those things often happen together. And unfortunately, like I said, Pennsylvania's behind the curve. I wish that Governor Shapiro was able to deliver on programs like Lifeline scholarships that he said he supports, that would help those kids in greatest need of a better education.
Representative Gleim.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for being here and testifying on this bill today. Other than this administration's desire to have corporate welfare, there is a culture, in my opinion, of using regulations to self-fund certain administrative departments. And I think you know what I'm talking about. I'll just give you an example. I have a restaurant in my area that, they get periodically, the Department of Ag will come in and review their restaurant procedures and see if everything is okay. But they're still getting a fine under that department, even though there's nothing wrong. They'll find something. We hear that on construction sites when OSHA, shows up. There's nothing that they can really pinpoint, but they're still getting, a $100 fine. Anyway, what are the barriers keeping our colleagues on the other side and this governor from supporting this bill?
That's a great question. I turn that question back on you all. What are some of the barriers? This is common sense, bipartisan reform. Now, REINS Act has passed the House chamber in previous sessions with bipartisan support. That's really important to remember. And I welcome any feedback you have as to why this is not more talked about on the other side of the aisle.
Yeah, I think Emily's being polite. I think, we should be direct. I think when you look at who funds their campaigns and puts them into office, it becomes abundantly clear that some of the biggest beneficiaries of an overly burdensome regulatory environment are the same people that give millions of dollars to Governor Shapiro and House Democrats.
Thank you. And one question just to follow up. Do you have an economic impact on regulations just for small businesses in our state?
Yeah, so I'll follow up with you and share our study that takes a closer look at the reg environment here in Pennsylvania and what that means for our businesses.
Thank you.
Representative Schlegel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One of the disadvantages of having the opportunity to ask questions at the end is that a lot of my questions that I had and that were prompted by your great testimony have already been asked. So at the risk of being redundant, I'll forego the redundancy. I really appreciate, though, as I always do, the substantive nature of testimonies from you, Emily, and on behalf of the Americans for Prosperity and for anyone that ever testifies from the Commonwealth Foundation. And I know that you talked about shortages in healthcare. You talked about land use reform, eliminating single-family use only zoning laws. I think that those are all great ideas, and they are things that could certainly benefit my constituents in Lebanon County. One of the things that I was advised when I came to the House was to be careful when you look to sponsor amendments or to co-sponsor or serve as the prime sponsor on legislation is that regulatory piece. And I can tell you that obviously 3 years into my tenure here in the House, if I'm still talking about that, it obviously had left an indelible mark. And certainly I think moving forward, your testimony today and this hearing contributes to that. One of the issues that I have in my district has to do with truck traffic. In Lebanon County, we are growing. We are increasing housing developments. We are bringing in more businesses, also warehouses, and along with that is truck traffic. And I can't help but think of my folks in a 55-plus community that has to hear of the truck noise and the applying of brakes coming down an off ramp at 2, 3, 4 in the morning, and the impact that regulation still has on inhibiting the chance to try to address that. Yes, we want our trucks to come down that off ramp as safely as possible, but there's got to be some way that our folks in that particular community can get a good night's sleep, and the trucks can still come down that off ramp safe and sound. So, you mentioned some agencies that we have concerns about with regulatory issues, and certainly there's more than just one. So I'm hopeful that that particular issue is something that some of the issues that you have raised and some of the suggestions and some of the legislation that you've highlighted can help to contribute to alleviating that problem on behalf of my constituents. And I'm sure there's other communities in other parts of the Commonwealth that would benefit from such reform as well. So again, thank you for your testimony. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Rep. Schlegel. Representative Shalaba.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here this morning. I want to ask a question on sort of a novel issue we're encountering and trying to address in the Commonwealth. We're seeing an absolute explosion of AI and AI-related fields and industry in the Commonwealth and across the United States and really the globe. Most recently, we were privy to the $20 billion announcement of the Amazon investment in Berwick. My question for you is, there's a gut reaction, a knee-jerk reaction always to over-regulate anything new, anything prosperous. What do you expect to happen to Pennsylvania if we over-regulate a blossoming industry like AI in comparison to the other states?
Yeah, I would first start with, I think anytime businesses want to invest in our state, that's great. I think, we've sort of touched on it, but it's worth note. We shouldn't go out of our way in, billions of dollars of corporate welfare to attract them here. We should create an environment where they want to come invest in the state. So it's great we got Amazon. I think that's positive news, but I think we got to ask what we did to get them there. And if we reformed our tax code, if we made a less burdensome regulatory environment, if we had programs that are favorable to families like school choice, would these businesses come here anyway? And I think that we know the answer is yes. We've seen that happen in other states. And as for AI and regulation, we know, we've seen the consequences of overly burdensome regulation. So I'd encourage, the same caution and restraint we want to see across the board here in Pennsylvania, I would apply to AI. I think there's proof that easing regulations is having a positive economic impact in neighboring and other states that are similar to us. And I would say that we should be looking at their approach, not what we already have here, which is a high burden regulatory environment.
And I'll just add too, I know that there's been recent discussion around this given Congress's inclusion of this topic in the reconciliation bill. I'm happy to provide you with some AFP resources offline as well.
Representative Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your testimony. It is extremely helpful, not just here, but also what you do on a regular basis to support free market solutions to a lot of our problems. I'm a firm believer in storytelling being a very powerful part of this, and I think we need to tell our individual stories as much as we possibly can. I spend a lot of time, as everybody does up here, I'm sure, talking to their constituents. This is not a small town problem or a big city problem. I have a candle maker in Philadelphia that said he could expand his business and that he could hire more people, but the regs within Philly and within the state is preventing him from doing so. What you're saying is exactly right. He's considering moving to New Jersey. We had in a hearing earlier that I was involved in, a legislator actually say that people from Pennsylvania are moving to Jersey and New York and Massachusetts because essentially they're giving them more stuff, which a quick Google search can show them moving to North Carolina, Tennessee, and Florida. Another story, if you can tell it personally, I have a daughter and a son-in-law that moved to Tennessee for economic opportunity. And I have a son and a daughter-in-law that can't buy a house in Media, Pennsylvania. So Kevin and I have talked about that before. But those stories are important. I have a hair salon locally at a wedding, and she was telling me the licensing that she has to get to extend her services is absurd. So my question for you is, I sit there and think, okay, I'll cover the stories. But you are the policy geeks. Let's just say it how it is. As far as policy, what I'm looking for, I can collect the stories and tell the stories. But what, in simplest of terms, can I tell a regular constituent? Here's a good place to start. If we talk about the REINS Act, not a lot of people, are going to respond to the REINS Act because they just don't know what the REINS Act. Some of us had to learn about the REINS Act. So what would be your advice in talking to, this owner of the hair salon or the owner of the local pizza shop? Here's what we're doing. Here's what we're offering to get them off of your back.
Well, I feel really qualified to answer this question because this is what I do for a living. So thank you so much for teeing me up for this question. Look, I know we've talked a lot about policies. I wanted to offer some polling before we wrap up today. So Americans for Prosperity, Pennsylvania, received polling in July of 2024 that shows that 55% of Pennsylvanians say lawmakers should have more control over regulations, compared to the 27% of Pennsylvanians who say the governor, the executive, or agencies should have more power in determining these regulations. That's pretty decisive if I've ever heard it. So as far as storytelling, that is what we do best at Americans for Prosperity Pennsylvania. We want to uplift your constituents, share their stories, and help them connect to decision makers. Now, you're sharing stories of your constituents, your families, but ultimately we know that the folks in this room, thank you, are not the ones standing between us and restoring legislative oversight. So we as an organization can help share the stories of those who may live in districts where their member needs to be moved on this issue. And I can guarantee you we are certainly doing that through meeting them where they are at events, one-on-one coffee meetings, talking with them about how their voice is the most important tool in their toolkit. And if they continue to amplify that voice, we can make real change. So again, thank you for the layup. I appreciate it, Representative.
I will not be as gracious because I would like the record to show I'm not a geek. I thought I was here because I was charming and good looking. But to your point, the way I would talk about it, and our policy team does an excellent job, and they make it really easy to show up and talk to you guys about all of these good proposals and what they do. But the way I would talk about it with the average person in my district is we don't want unelected bureaucrats forcing you to jump through hoops, making it harder for you to do what you want to do, which is have a business, make a living, and provide for your family and community. And it's that simple. Yes, things like RAINs and yes, Senator Phillips Hill's TRAP Act, they are complex. They are big, comprehensive proposals, and that's admirable, and it's important because that's the kind of change we need if we're going to move our state forward. But at the end of the day, we just want to make it a little bit easier for people to get by.
And accountability goes both ways too. I mean, we will hold members accountable when they need to be held accountable, but there's also positive accountability. And for those of you in this room, we would love for you to co-sponsor House Bill 1601, show enthusiasm for the RAINS Act. And again, Representative Kephart, thank you so much for saying, look, I'm running on the RAINS Act. I want to see this come to fruition. So that's why I'm running for office. That is such a cool story. But let us know what you're hearing in District 2. We would love to host a town hall with you. Talk about how you're fighting for legislative oversight and a constitutionally limited government. We want to help you and amplify your voice in the district as well.
Thank you very much. And I say geek in the most complimentary way, Kevin. So
I'll take it.
As
I'll
in
take geek.
knowledge, yes. All right. Thank you guys very much.
Thank you, Representative. I want to recognize Appropriations Chairman Struzzi for a quick comment.
Thank you, Chairman Rowe. Good morning. Thank you both for being here. As always, we appreciate your partnership and your testimony on these issues. I think we're all very concerned with where we are right now with regulations, looking at the potential before our state with energy, with the AI, with the data centers. Every opportunity we have before us right now could be delayed by the permitting process. So I don't really have a question, but I do appreciate that we can work with you to identify those regulations that get in the way of attracting business back to Pennsylvania, growing businesses here. I think when people talk about regulatory reform, right, it sounds great, but it's such a big thing, right? So I think what would be helpful to us is to kind of hone in on those specific regulations that we either need to reform or simply get rid of sooner rather than later, so that we aren't missing these opportunities coming to our state right now. Because I can tell you that I'm very concerned with the potential for failure, because these regulations are going to force these entities in this global market we're in right now, this race for data centers, for energy consumption and production, to go to those other states that we have mentioned throughout this hearing today. So any assistance you can provide to really help us narrow down on where we should be putting a black line through some of this stuff would be very helpful. So I appreciate you being here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Struzzi. Representative Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you, Director Green. Thank you, Director Kane, for being here. You're both obviously very young, so I'm surprised you haven't left this state yet. So thank you for sticking around and fighting this fight with us. I actually, in sort of a form of a question, but more generally, a thank you to you guys for and your organizations for promoting and letting folks know about the RAINS Act. And so when I think about all of our unchecked bureaucracies that we have here, and we have a laundry list. You can go down through pretty much any list. We were talking about it earlier. Anything with the word department behind it is an unchecked bureaucracy that governs through regulation, not legislation. And as we approach our 250th, and we live here in Pennsylvania, the birthplace of independence, I think of our Declaration of Independence and 26 different things that were enumerated, that they were living under a tyrant. And one of them jumps out to me as we have this conversation right now, and it says, "He has combined with others to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution." That, to me, is our unchecked bureaucracy and regulation that we live under. We live under a jurisdiction that is foreign to our Constitution and unacknowledged by our laws, giving his assent to their acts of pretended legislation. That is what we are living under right now in Pennsylvania, the birthplace of freedom. It's time to have a new birth of freedom, a new Declaration of Independence. And thankfully, we don't have to do it the way they did. We can do this by having the legislature take back that authority from the unchecked bureaucracy. We are the largest full-time legislature in the nation. Now listen, we do a lot of great work back in our districts, but we're only here in Harrisburg 60 or so days out of the year. I'm willing to be here 120 days out of the year if we can pull back on these unchecked bureaucracies and do our job as legislators. So thank you for what you're doing. Thank you for promoting this. To put that all in the form of a question, it would be, how do we get the word out to the people of Pennsylvania? Because that's who needs to make the change. It needs to be a grassroots movement where they start talking to their elected representatives to take back their authority.
Absolutely, and hearing your comments, I think we would be remiss not to talk about the concept of judicial deference as well. Pennsylvania has a mixed history when it comes to whether the courts defer to state agencies for their interpretation of a regulation versus the legislature. So there's also a renewed enthusiasm for addressing that in statute across the country. So wanted to make sure we address that as well. But no, to your point, this is a grassroots movement. And to echo my comments earlier, the members in this room, thank you. You are not standing in the way of restoring legislative oversight into regulations that are crippling our economy. So really appreciate that. Americans for Prosperity Pennsylvania, we're running a full court press. We have what you call an I volunteer petition that we are targeting in certain districts that may stand as a roadblock to the REINS Act. Working to build a policy majority so that we can get this done in short order. But our grassroots activists are really enthused about this issue, especially given the fact that we're seeing enthusiasm across the country. And it's really tough for me as the state director for the Pennsylvania chapter to see my colleagues have these really, really incredible wins in states where we could be doing this too. So rest assured that AFP Pennsylvania is running a full court press to make sure we get this through the finish line.
That's great.
Representative Twardzik.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our testifiers. It was an enlightening Monday morning here in Harrisburg, and we get to start the week off with the fact that we've got great colleagues here that are fighting for our Pennsylvanians. Quick question regarding our permitting. This past session, the governor decided to put we'll give you your money back if you don't get your permit. I was wondering, has that had any success?
Yeah, so you're referring to the payback program, and my criticism of those programs is, again, it's really baby steps in terms of what we need. So the numbers are still coming in, and we have some time to see what that program looks like. But in theory, it's good. In practice, we haven't seen the results we're hoping for. I support the concept of if government doesn't process your permit on time, like you absolutely should, get your fees back. But the problem is most of our permits are tied up in DEP, and the average wait time for DEP is 6 months. So we're requiring businesses to wait way too long to get to work. And I think, again, that's why we're advocating for comprehensive reform, because these tiny, small steps are not what are going to keep us competitive with neighboring states.
And I'll just add, I echo Kevin's comments, and while I appreciate Representative Anderson sharing that we are policy geeks, I will take that. But ultimately, I represent the grassroots, and the grassroots includes business owners who are just trying to make ends meet. A lot of folks have told us, look, this is great, but we want our permits. We just want to get the permit. So just my 2 cents on behalf of the grassroots.
I appreciate that, and if you'd like to help me, perhaps I could introduce legislation that says not only do you get your money back, but the default position will be you get your permit. And again, if we turn out that we have to give permit after permit, the state will wake up and say maybe we need more people to return to their offices to get these permits out on time. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Rep. Twardzik. All right, I got 2 quick questions myself, and I'm going to turn it over to Representative Kephart for some closing remarks and questions of his own. So a couple of weeks ago, we met with one of our local hospitals, and they were going over their numbers and their regulatory compliance, and they showed us the numbers that demonstrate that a quarter of every dollar that a hospital takes in, they have to spend on compliance. And when we're looking at the healthcare industry, which is a massive industry, we're talking about billions, if not trillions of dollars over the years in compliance costs. So we're looking at everybody's looking at healthcare costs continue to skyrocket. Well, when 25% of your costs is just regulatory compliance, of course your costs are going to go up. And we're talking about things, obviously everybody wants to be safe in a medical setting, but we're not talking about that. We're talking about the type of compliance where this hospital moved a TV in a conference room and was not allowed to use that conference room for 3 months until Department of Health showed up and said, yeah, that TV's fine there, right? Like they couldn't use a conference room for 3 months because of a regulation. These are the kind of absurd things that the healthcare industry is dealing with, but extrapolate that out to energy, to manufacturing. What are we missing, and how much of a cost driver is regulation? I know that we have in here, Director Kane, you highlighted some specific numbers about if we deregulated what it would do for us, but what are we missing on the side of how much of the cost across the country is being driven by overregulation?
That's astounding, and I would love to work with our policy team to get you that analysis. Truly astounding.
Yeah, I would just add, our research shows that rolling back regulation will lead to significant economic growth. But you don't have to rely on our research. We can look again at other states that have done these things, and we know that their GDP is rising, they're creating more jobs. They're letting people keep more of their hard-earned money. So we've seen that these programs work.
And one of the most interesting things, again, everybody wants to be safe, but we're not talking about regulations that keep people safe. We're talking about reporting requirements. The hospital has to report data that when they go back and check, their own data that they're required to report isn't even published for 4 years. So why is the data, how could healthcare data possibly be relevant currently if it's 4 years old? And if that's the point, why are they reporting things that they're already required to report to the feds? So that was one question about just the cost driver. The second one, to Representative Anderson's excellent point, the regulatory conversation can be somewhat, ethereal and out there, and it's not really made personal until you have to deal with the regulatory environment. And DEP will regularly say, well, it takes so many years to get a permit because we're understaffed, right? We don't have enough people. But in my personal experience, we have a small business. We're not talking about a multi-billion-dollar healthcare system. We're not talking about a multi-billion-dollar energy company. There's massive teams of attorneys on retainer. We're talking about a literal mom-and-pop shop. And they wanted to replace a drain pipe. And I've talked about this in this committee before because it perfectly highlights the absurdity of the regulatory and permitting environment. Mom and pop shop wanted to replace a cracked drain pipe, tried to do the right thing. It has now been 3 years, tens of thousands of dollars. They have not been able to replace the pipe. We finally convened a meeting in one of my district offices with congressional staff and the business owner and half a dozen staff from DEP to talk about all the different ways we could potentially resolve this. And when I pointed out to one of the DEP staff that there exists a permit that allows you to simply replace existing infrastructure rather than this whole new permit they were making the business owner go through. And I said, well, couldn't we have just done that permit? It takes 1 day, signs off, and it's done. And the guy said, well, we probably could have, but we're doing this one now instead. So we have half a dozen DEP personnel that are working for 3 years on a permit that they admitted wasn't even necessary. So how much of DEP's backlog is actually a self-inflicted issue versus them being understaffed, as they like to claim in budget hearings?
I can speak to our activists who have dealt with these issues. There's an activist in Western Pennsylvania who I know has shared he's worked with the DEP. He has tried to share some of his concerns, particularly with respect to Chapter 105 permitting. Don't assume malice when ignorance is to blame, right? That was kind of his experience with it. Well, they just didn't have an answer for him. Not because they didn't want to give him an answer, but they didn't have an answer. So I think that highlights a bigger problem that we should certainly be looking into, and also highlights why these decisions should be in the hands of the General Assembly and not unelected bureaucrats.
Yeah, and I would just add, first of all, credit to the small business in your community that has the grit to stick it out over 3 years. Unfortunately, that's all too common, not the case. In Northumberland County recently, we lost a plastic recycling plant 300 jobs. I mean, these are real life people who are now without that opportunity over one stormwater drain permit that the fight dragged on for 6 months. I mean, that's unacceptable. So credit to the business in your community that wants to be here, wants to prosper here in Pennsylvania. I admire that. And I think what I'd say about DEP is when one agency accounts for a fifth of the regulations on the books, I think you got to stop and ask yourself, are some of these duplicative or punitive, and what can we do to get them out of the way? Because 1/5 of 164,000 regulations should just, again, raise red flags for all of us.
Well, thank you very much. I think it's really important to highlight those small businesses. And to your point, Director Kane, the last time I talked to the business owner, he said, I don't need this. I could be in Florida with my grandkids. And he's not a young man, so he could definitely just leave. And that's unfortunately why we are slated to lose yet another congressional seat in the next round of redistricting. We've lost at least one every census for the last 100 years. And we're losing it to states like Texas, Florida, and North Carolina, states that are just doing it better. I really appreciate your time here today. I'm going to turn it over to Representative Kephart for a final question and some closing remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I just want to ask one more quick question. I'm thinking of things we can do immediately as well to help the situation. And one that comes to mind, and I was wondering if you guys had any input on this, is, look, we're always going to be dealing with, King Wolf and Shapiro, given their edicts and things like Reggie and COVID and all that. But they came up with Reggie out of thin air. It never existed. But one thing I think we could do, and maybe you guys can elaborate on this a little bit, is maybe in these bills, instead of just saying delegate to X agency to make good law in area Y, could we as a legislature maybe tighten it up of how we're writing this? So maybe we're putting in the legislation, what needs to be done exactly, instead of letting it up to some administrative agency to go ahead and do it. I mean, you mentioned basically the Chevron problem at the federal level, but at the state level, that's a whole hearing on itself. But, could we do that so that, there is less room for wiggle on that?
It's a great question, and certainly I think that we could have a broader conversation around that. But you mentioned the edicts from Governor Shapiro, from former Governor Tom Wolf. The answer should be that we are advocating that Shapiro's colleagues that are setting the calendar on your side of the building, if they're great ideas, great. Let's bring it to a vote.
Okay, so, well, as we hear today, regulatory reform is much needed. And, we need a regulatory climate that allows all to succeed, just not the politically connected in Pennsylvania. And I would say we need to rein in the bureaucracies, measures like the REINS Act. So thank you both again for being here and providing your testimony and your continued work in this sphere. What we need to do is get serious about regulatory reform in Pennsylvania. So thank you both, and thank you, Chairman Rowe, for holding this important hearing.
Thank you, Representative Kephart. I think nothing summarizes best the importance of cutting red tape than one of the governor's own favorite accomplishments to tout, right? The rebuilding of I-95, where after it collapsed, within one day, the governor announced an executive order to cut the red tape, and we rebuilt it in record time. Well, imagine what we could do if we cut the red tape for every small business owner in the Commonwealth instead of the governor's agencies alone. Imagine, exactly as you pointed out, Director Kane, a 36% reduction in the regulatory environment, creating 180,000 jobs, an extra $1,700 per household, and a $9.2 billion increase in the GDP. When we are staring down a multi-billion-dollar structural deficit that if the Commonwealth level funded the budget, didn't increase spending by 1 penny, we would still be in the hole in 2 years. This is how we grow our way out of that structural deficit, by passing common sense regulatory reform. And I want to thank you both very much for your time here today. Other states have successfully reduced their regulatory standards, as you both testified here today, without detrimental results. Instead, their economies have exploded as they continue. The only detriment to PA is that they are stealing our constituents. They are stealing our congressional representation. Regulatory reform is about empowering opportunity, unleashing innovation, and putting trust back back in job creators and the skilled workforce that we need to grow Pennsylvania. Pennsylvanians deserve a better government, not a bigger one. Our conversation on cutting red tape will continue on Friday, June 20th. We'll be addressing the child care crisis and the impact of regulations on that industry. Until then, this meeting is adjourned.